Let's talk about some angry Space Marine battle line with Chainswords, and what makes the Assault Intercessor squad a solid choice in game at the moment. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd do another Space Marine unit review. In this one we're talking Assault Intercessors, the Space Marine battle line with bolt pistol and chainsword, ready to take the fight to the enemy at close quarters. We'll talk briefly about the models and their role in battle, then take a look at their datasheet and talk about the buffs and synergies that they can have in game. Models and lore-wise, the Assault Intercessors were first made a thing in 9th edition Warhammer 40k. They were the base troops of the Indomitus box set, and it was interesting to see the sort of battle line Space Marines being able to take bolt pistol and chainsword, given that classically for the vast majority of chapters they tended to be fielded with rifle weapons, first the trusty tactical squad and then bolt rifle intercessors. I feel like it makes a lot of sense though for the chapters that prefer melee combat or deploying for close range engagements. The bolt pistol and chainsword are some of the Space Marines' most iconic weapons after all. As base troops miniatures, the models I think are fine enough, basic Space Marines in Tacticus armour. I guess the chainswords are in some at least fairly dynamic poses. They had some monopose models that came out in Indomitus and some starter sets after that. Or their multi-part plastic kit, that's the one that's sold at the moment. That one has the option for some sergeant weapons like thunderhammers and power fists and things, and currently costs £40 or $62 US. Given they were so heavily discounted for quite so long, it's certainly worth having a bit of a shop around. It can be worth checking eBay and second hand, as a fair few people might have wound up with more of these than they wanted in 9th edition. But otherwise, as Warhammer goes, it's not the worst in terms of points per dollar ratio. In general, the 10-man Space Marine box sets tend to be at least okay, even if these are currently some of the cheapest Space Marines that you can put on the board. As ever, if you're looking to pick up these guys or any other Space Marines or other 40k miniatures, there's plenty of discount links that support the channel down in the video description. Places like Element Games in the UK for 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 21%, Wargame Portal for 15% in the USA, Fenris Workshop in Canada, and Tash and Geldeep in the EU. As ever, a big thank you to anyone supporting through those, and of course saving a bit of money versus Games Workshop's models. Let's get into their rules though. Currently in game for Codex Space Marines, Assault Intercessors are 75 points per 5 of them. 15 points per model I think is nice enough for a fairly basic Space Marine stat line. They've got their standard 2 wounds with a 3+ save. They get objective control 2 as they're essentially a troops equivalent, so they will have a fair bit more presence on objectives until they're taken down. In general, as Space Marines go, they're going to be at least fairly resilient against small arms, but anything with a little bit of AP and multi-damage will make fairly short work of them. They do have the battle line keyword, which means that you could field really quite a lot of them if you really wanted to, but in reality most of the time it just doesn't really make sense to. They don't really tend to be a unit that you use for your absolute mainline damage and defense versus elites. For their ranged weapons, they get some heavy bolt pistols. They've got some slightly longer range than the regular type one, 18-inch range and strength 4, AP 1, damage 1, so a little bit of threat there. The sergeant can then swap that out for either a plasma pistol or hand flamer. It definitely makes sense to go one or the other. I'd probably be more tempted just for the plasma pistol, though perhaps being a little bit on the judicious side as to whether or not you overcharge it. You really don't want to be failing a hazardous check and then costing himself all his fancy melee attacks just before he hits combat. They're rarely going to do anything too crazy, but good for a little bit of chip damage, either as they're closing in or in melee. You maybe just don't want to shoot enemy units to the point where you're causing so many casualties that you make your charge far longer and then they fail it. That will be a bit of an own goal in trying to go for a bit of extra damage there. Being the close quarters Marine melee troops, their main threat is in glorious close combat. They get 4 attacks with the Astartes Chainsword at strength 4, AP 1 and damage 1. They're going to be best at threatening toughness 3 and 4 infantry with saves that are kind of mid to poor, but with their special rule they should at least be able to stack a fair few wounds on most things even if they're kind of tough. For the sergeant, he has the option of either a power fist, power weapon or thunderhammer to upgrade that chainsword to. Given 40k war gear, it usually makes sense to go for the higher strength, higher AP and higher damage approach. The power weapon is just a bit further behind really. I think it'd need something like at least 1 extra attack if it was really going to compete with the big hitters. For the power fist and thunderhammer it's sort of close. The thunderhammer hits on 4s but gets devastating wounds. The fist gets more hits than doesn't. In general, more people tend to take the power fist versus the thunderhammer, though it's definitely not awful, and particularly with the possibility of 4 wound rerolls. Against certain high save things, the odd devastating wound with that is pretty nice, even if it can be a bit random whether you get any or not. Then though, when they're attacking with all those hits, they have their shock assault rule. This allows you to always reroll wound rolls of 1, so essentially about a 70% average damage buff compared with what they'd have normally. But then if the target of the attack happens to be on an objective marker, you get to reroll all wound rolls instead. That's quite nice for the strength 4 volume attacks, and certainly doesn't hurt the sort of mid-strength Power Fist or Thunderhammer, and means that they'll be wounding monsters and vehicles more often than not. And given their battlefield role being close range skirmishers with high OC, they're quite likely to want to be fighting over the midfield points anyway. Perhaps the best thing about this though is that it also applies to any characters that are attached to them. They get the special rule for the whole squad, and that will count any leaders. It's one of the cases where it's kind of odd that the squad buffs the character and then the character buffs the squad. It does make them a rather unusually excellent bodyguard unit, more so than plenty of other things in the Space Marine roster, as quite a lot of the characters that might attach to them have melee in the class of sort of strength 6 to strength 8, but really quite big and dangerous attacks, so it means that if they're re-rolling the wound rolls and all of those, they're going to be doing a lot more damage to monsters and vehicles than they would have been doing otherwise, and certainly everything else too. Just focusing on the base squad though, these are the sort of numbers that you might expect for them if they're charging into units on a mid-board objective. You'd be expecting to kill around about 10 termagants, around 3 space marines, only around about 1 terminator or 3 wounds to a vehicle with a 3+ save. Basically vastly more efficient against more sort of normal marine equivalents as opposed to really big tough stuff, though even there they're still going to take a chunk out of tough stuff given that they're only 75 points. On their own, they're not going to be super general purpose, but if you want to put a fighty character like a captain attached to them, then they are going to hit a lot harder. Overall, between all that, I'd rate their main strengths as being nice and cheap with high objective control. If they're fielded alone, then they can be a nice skirmishing trading unit on mid-board objectives, but perhaps the thing that makes them extra great is the good character attachment options with the ability to buff their melee, and be a nice cheap retinue for a character that you really want on the board, with a certain few picks being extra standout as we'll get onto. They'll also enjoy any detachment that can improve their melee in some way, perhaps Blood Angels with their Liberator group in particular, though Black Templars and Space Wolves and Gladius with the Lance Stratagem can all be helpful too. For their downsides, they are fairly slow moving infantry that want to be in close combat, and that might give them problems unless you've got some way to get them there like advance and charge or transport. Their damage alone isn't particularly general purpose, high toughness and high saves are going to have them falling slightly flat. And while they're fairly cheap and fairly dangerous for their points cost given that they're base troops, they don't bring along any army support rules which you might want for the overall mission play, things like scouts with their infiltrate and redeploying shenanigans, infiltrators with infiltrate and deep strike denial, or incursors with their scout and marking units for +1 to hit for gun lines. For raw damage and defense for the points cost, they're likely to be better than any of these, but might do a little bit less in terms of army support and mission support if it was a direct trade-off of one or the other. They're definitely a unit that can certainly have a role in strong competitive army lists though. Getting on to unit support and combos, as with all Space Marines they can use Oath of Moment, raising their average damage by about a third, given that they hit on 3s without any improvements. I feel like for the most part, if they're on their own you're going to have something better to target that on, but every so often there might be just an incidental combat that's the most important thing on the board, and 4 rerolls to hit and wound give them a far higher chance of doing something nasty. For general stratagems, unless you're going with a character for a big turn of melee, I'd probably keep support kind of light. Perhaps the most tempting things could be things like Armour of Contempt, if there's a good chance that it might be the difference between them striking back hard in melee or surviving on a mid-board objective. Grenade could definitely help them out in taking down, say, another Terminator equivalent on average, giving a better chance to actually one-round something like an elite infantry squad or a damaged vehicle or something. And they could use melee support things such as heroic intervention or counter-offensive. I feel like they wouldn't really be ones that you'd really plan around all that much though. And I feel like for the most part they're not going to have enormous amounts of hitting power that might justify heroic intervention compared with some scary melee stuff out there. For transports, I feel like you can pretty easily justify an impulsor if you really want to, though I think they're going to be far more worth it if you're investing in the squad more with an attached character. In general, having transports that are carting around things that cost more than them is generally a better idea than things that cost less, but depending on what's going with them, you could definitely justify it. I've certainly seen people using them with Blood Angels captains jumping out of impulsors. It can be quite an efficient battlefield taxi to use as a sort of staging point, moving up into the mid-board perhaps to try and get somewhere safe, and then on the turn when they're diving into melee, when they jump out the front of it, they'll gain an extra 3-inch worth of movement. So they could have quite a big threat range, particularly if you've got something to give them advance and charge to, like say the Blood Angels detachment or the Gladius. Otherwise, if you did want to go and try and use them as actual mainline damage dealers, maybe used as a 10-man squad with character support. I feel like you could get away with using a Land Raider for them. It might be a little bit of a less obvious thing to put in there than more scary things, but certain chapters can make them pretty nasty, particularly with, say, captain and lieutenant type combos. You could even have big threats like Marnius Calgar join them, even if he profits less from the rerolls personally. Or do something like a Blood Angels captain plus a Sanguinary priest for a squad that's going to have enough threats to really hit something very hard in melee. If wanting to transport 10 men, but not wanting to pay the premium for the assault ramp, I guess you could use a repulsor as well. That feels a little bit less obvious though, given it pairs a bit better with ranged things from its special rules, but still it's really quite an efficient unit at 180 points for that toughness and those guns. For characters, you could certainly justify one if you wanted to, and you could make a fairly cheapish, fairly fighty-ish squad if you're maybe aiming to use them as something for a sort of medium tier threat as opposed to an expendable trading unit that can skirmish in the midboard. I'd say probably out of the generic character choices, if you wanted one, the regular captain might pair with them one of the best. His free stratagems might not be quite as impactful here as some places, though definitely could be good for certain things like maybe the Gladius, Lance and AP one. And then he adds a whole bunch of likely Power Fist attacks with Strength 8, AP 2, Damage 2, all hitting very accurately. And he gets a turn of big melee where he gets bonus attacks and devastating wounds. That could be really nice if you're charging onto a midboard objective with that active. A huge amount of melee threats from the captain personally, re-rolling wounds, never mind what the rest of the squad does. Between that he feels like maybe the single best fit. Otherwise, perhaps my next choice might be a lieutenant. He's a little bit cheaper, adds extra damage with his lethal hits, and still has a fair bit of melee threat as well. I feel like perhaps the lethal hits just has a tiny bit of anti-synergy given that they can re-roll wound rolls. He still definitely wouldn't be a bad choice though. Otherwise, maybe he could use a chaplain, though I feel like they're really hurting for things that are higher AP in their unit, and I feel like as a result I more likely want to go for the lieutenant over the chaplain. He could make the squad a bit more reliable against tougher vehicles though, if they were wounding on a 5 goes to a 4 and then re-roll it on the Power Fist. That'd be converting some wound rolls quite reliably. And then beyond that I feel like the others are a little bit less obvious. The Judas here is not terrible, but might be better with Blade Guard, and something that can more reliably just flat out delete units, and then it'd be enough to deter charges. The Librarian could give a 4+ invulnerable, the Apothecary could restore some models, and the Ancient could give them some extra OC. I'd probably be most tempted by Captains or Lieutenants overall though. Really though, for character choices, there's plenty of ones that make Assault Intercessors really quite a strong meta unit. First up, we've got Uriel Ventris of the Ultramarines, who's often seen running around with them. He's just an absolutely powerful datasheet that got even better recently. He adds Deep Strike to a unit which he doesn't have to join, so could Deep Strike some Devastator Centurions in Vanguard, or some Eradicators elsewhere perhaps. And then beyond that, he just wants to put him on the board as a fighty character with a bunch of Strength 6, AP 2, Damage 2 attacks with sustained hits. This Assault Intercessor squad is giving him a retinue that doesn't cost too much, maybe gives him reroll wounds, and also makes him a little bit sturdier for skirmishing in the midboard, where he's now got that command points debuff rule, which would be really quite annoying to have if the opponent's damage dealers are trying to advance around and use stratagems on things. He works really well with Assault Intercessors, and it's probably a debate between these and Company Heroes overall. Another standout character who gets lots of play with Assault Intercessors is Grandmaster Azrael of the Dark Angels. Generally he's a character that you almost always want in the army given the command point farming, and while he can go for a big investment squad like Hellblasters to get the most out of his invulnerable save and sustained hits, lots of people seem to prefer running him with the Assault Intercessors, as then you don't really feel too bad about hiding him for the first few turns while he rustles up command points, and then hopefully aims to get into a staging point in the midboard ruin, and then perhaps from turns 3 onwards he can go out and be more aggressive on the midboard objectives. The Lion's Sword absolutely loves those devastating wounds, and he does give the unit sustained hits and the invulnerable save as well, so they are going to be abnormally effective at their job. There's a few other units that he could lead as well, things like Hellblasters or Inner Circle Companions or a fair few more. Assault Intercessors have been the most common one that I've seen recently though. Otherwise, as mentioned, the Assault Intercessors just tend to be godly for the Blood Angels. They seem to be the chapter that really tips the balance between them just being fairly good against medium infantry to light infantry versus just being an all-round terrifying melee threat. On the charge, the Liberator Assault group gives them +2 strength to strength 6 and +1 attack to 5 attacks each. The Power Fist will be strength 10 with 4 attacks as well, which is all very nice. And then added that to their wound rerolls and they're rather fearsome. They've got access to advance and charge for a stratagem, and access to Red Rampage for lethal hits and lance. If they go both, they'd be sacrificing their objective control, but between all those buffs together you've got a spectacular amount of hits There could be +1 to wound with lethal hits and rerolls to wound as well, so loads of those converting. Likely enough stack damage to ruin a lot of units' day, plus particularly if you've got something like a captain in there to throw a bunch of strength 10 power fists into the mix and maybe trigger some of those stratagems for free. If you really wanted to go absolutely all in, you could use a sanguinary priest as well. Getting those chainswords up to AP2 and adding a 5+ feel no pain on top of all that will turn them into a unit that can just blend the majority of things in 40k. Just through sheer volume of ferocious attacks plus some power fists. I feel like that combo, if you were going all in, could make a big squad and a land raider really quite justifiable. Otherwise though, for detachments, out of the core codex ones, I feel like they're probably most likely to be seen in Gladius. The turn of advance and charge could be really useful for them, plus being able to flex into it, and their lance and extra AP stratagem could be nice. Otherwise, a bunch of them do have benefits that do help out, but maybe not significantly more than certain other things out there. Firestorm could have +1 to wound and strength 5 bolt pistols, Vanguard could get cover and stealth, and maybe things like reactive moves. Ironstorm could give you some rerolls with plasma pistols and power fists, and Stormlance gives you advance and charge, but most other support is focused around mounted things. Beyond the chapter specific stuff that we've mentioned, you could have a lot of other things lead them. Chief Librarian Tigerius, Cato Sicarius, and Corsaro Khan could all be fine. I feel like Ragnar Blackmane is a particularly good fit as well. He definitely feels like a character that gets a huge amount out of their reroll wounds thing. He strikes with 10 attacks at strength 8, AP 3, damage 2 and sustained hits, so getting reroll wounds on that against monsters and vehicles means that he is going to be a crazy threat in his own right. He's very usable when jumping out of an impulsor with them, and the Champions of Rust does have some helpful things for them as well, Feel No Pains and various other melee boosts. For the Dark Angels, you could have the other characters join them, though I feel like Azrael is the most standout. And for the Black Templars, Helbrecht and the Emperor's Champion both could work fine here as well. Maybe their issue is more that they're often going to want to join Sword Brethren to have a threat that can truly just one round the majority of things in the game when buffed. So you don't tend to see Emperor's Champions or Helbrechts running around with the Assault Intercessors so much. And they also do have the competitive Crusader squads as well if you're going for a 10-man unit. Righteous Crusaders could be helpful though, getting extra AP and melee for a stratagem and locking stuff up could be nice, as could their melee boosts from their vows. In terms of how often they tend to hit the table in competitive lists, there's certainly a unit that does see some competitive play, as mentioned. Codex Space Marines has an enormous amount of competition, and a lot of things are in the sort of place where they're good in the right detachment that you probably look at other things elsewhere. I feel like you can absolutely make good use of them just in their own right as a cheapish skirmish unit to fight for the midboard. Though for that role, I feel like a lot of people just tend to gravitate more towards the other Space Marine support and skirmish type units, things like Scouts and Infiltrators and Jump Intercessors, all of which have their own selling points and can be a bit better for doing things like secondary objectives or board control type things. And the Jump Intercessors do have their speed, of course, even if they lack the rerolls. In general, as a result, I'd be far more tempted to use them if you had a specific named character to escort, or specifically Blood Angels captains playing in the Liberator Assault group. Uriel Ventris, Grandmaster Azrael, Ragnar Blackmane, or buffed Blood Angels characters all look rather great. I'd say that's where they're probably top tier, and otherwise merely an okay objective trading unit. For the character escorting sort of role, a lot of the Divergent Chapter 1s can't join the Company of Heroes because they have their own command squad variants, like Azrael with the Inner Circle. But for Uriel Ventris, maybe the decision might be whether to go with these guys or Company Heroes, either save 20 points and get some big melee rerolls, or go for the chunkier Company Heroes with 16 wounds overall and a -1 to wound built in, plus a few interesting profiles like the Heavy Bolter and the Champion. In any case though, overall I'd certainly rate the Assault Intercessors as a solid competitive unit. I wouldn't tend to go too crazy on them in terms of big numbers, unless perhaps you're running them with the Blood Angels, which I think do enough to tip them into mainline damage dealers, though I still don't think it'd be an awful choice to go somewhat heavy-ish in some of the other melee chapters, like Black Templars and Space Wolves. Unless going all in for some sort of multi-character attached Land Raider unit, I'd likely usually go for 5-man squads, taking either the Power Fist or the Thunderhammer on the Sergeant, plus a Plasma Pistol. If they're just running solo, then likely moving up towards the mid-board objectives to be an expendable skirmish and trading unit there. If they're running with a character, maybe being a little bit safer, moving up behind cover, or maybe using an impulsor to get them there, and then make sure they get the charge on something somewhat important on the mid-board objectives, using their big rerolls, and maybe using the transport or advance and charge to get them there. Any stratagems that could give them, say, lance melee, extra AP, or other melee damage buffs will certainly be enjoyed. In any case though, I'll leave that there for this one. Let me know your thoughts as to these fighty Space Marines down in the comments below. Have your Chainsword battle line been seeing the table much in 10th edition, and why or why not? As mentioned, if you were looking to pick up any 40k models at any point, feel free to check out the channel's discount retailers down in the video description. In any case, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, while certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support and keep them coming, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics has a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a few advantages: seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.